At 2:37 in the afternoon, the east wing of Harlow Peak Military Medical Center exploded. Not a gas leak, not a malfunction. A deliberate, calculated detonation that blew the windows out of 6 rooms simultaneously and sent a fireball rolling through the trauma corridor. Patients fell from gurneys. Nurses screamed and ran. Security guards drew weapons and had no idea which direction to point them. In the middle of all that chaos, while every trained professional in the building was running away from the blast, one woman, a quiet, unremarkable nurse who had worked there for less than a month, turned around and ran straight toward it. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew who she really was. They were about to find out. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if it hooks you the way I think it will, tap that like button and share it with someone who loves a good fight back story. Now let's get into it. The morning of the attack started the same way. Every morning at Harlow Peak started with Diane Sutton telling Claire Morrow she was doing something wrong. Claire had arrived 6 minutes early for her shift, which at Harlow Peak Military Medical Center in Casper, Wyoming, was considered barely adequate. The hospital ran on military time in more ways than one. The attending physicians expected perfection. The charge nurses expected deference. And Diane Sutton, Claire's direct supervisor, expected both of those things plus an explanation any time Claire deviated from the exact procedure Diane had outlined during orientation 3 weeks ago. "You're charting from last night's handoff," Diane said, sliding a printed copy across the nurse's station counter without looking up from her own clipboard. "You used shorthand on the medication logs again." Claire picked up the paper. "The shorthand is accurate. It matches the pharmacy records exactly. It's not our protocol." Standard military nursing notation. Diane finally looked up. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s, with reading glasses that she wore slightly too low on her nose, which gave everything she said a quality of mild condescension. "This isn't a field station, Morrow. This is an accredited military medical facility. We use full notation." Claire said nothing. She took the paper back, set it beside her bag, and went to begin her morning rounds. She had been here 22 days. In that time, she had been corrected 14 times by Diane, twice by the Chief of Staff's office manager, and once, memorably, by a 26-year-old physician's assistant named Derek Holt, who had pulled her aside after a procedure to inform her that she had positioned a patient's arm support not quite right. Derek Holt had graduated medical school 18 months ago and had never been outside the continental United States. Claire had spent 4 years working in places where the medical equipment arrived on helicopters, and the operating table was sometimes a door propped on sawhorses. She had not said any of that to Derek Holt. She had nodded, thanked him, and adjusted the arm support 1 inch to the left to satisfy him. That was the arrangement she had made with herself when she came to Harlow Peak. Stay quiet, stay small, do the work and let the work speak for itself, and don't give anyone a reason to dig into the file she'd spent 2 years carefully burying. It was a reasonable plan. It had worked for almost 3 weeks. Harlow Peak sat on the eastern edge of Casper, a sprawling facility that served both active-duty military personnel from the nearby installation and a large civilian population from the surrounding county. It had 4 wings, 2 trauma bays, a surgical suite on the 3rd floor, and a long-term recovery ward on the 4th that housed, among other patients, a rotating roster of high-security cases that the administration didn't put on the general census. Claire had noticed the high-security ward on her 2nd day, not because anyone pointed it out, they specifically didn't point it out, but because she noticed the things other people didn't. The reinforced door at the end of the east corridor. The 2 uniformed military police stationed outside it on 12-hour rotations. The way the regular nursing staff unconsciously routed their rounds to avoid that hallway. She noticed those things, and she cataloged them, and she moved on, because noticing things was not the same as acting on them, and acting on things was exactly what she had promised herself she would stop doing. At 9:15 that morning, she was changing a dressing on a patient in room 114 when she saw the van for the 2nd time. It was a gray panel van with no markings, parked in the service access lane on the east side of the building. She had seen it the previous afternoon in the same spot for nearly 4 hours. Service vehicles came and went. This one sat. She'd checked the window 3 times during her shift yesterday, and it hadn't moved. Now it was back. She finished the dressing, disposed of her gloves, made a note in the patient's chart, and walked to the window at the end of the hallway. The van was parked in an access lane marked for emergency vehicles only. There was no driver visible. The engine appeared to be off. She stood there for 30 seconds, watching, and then she turned away because she had promised herself. At 11:40, she was in the break room eating a sandwich she hadn't tasted when Derek Holt came in, poured himself a coffee, and leaned against the counter with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told his instincts were wrong. "You know what your problem is," he said. Claire looked at him. "You move like you're somewhere else," Derek said. "Like you're always half expecting something bad to happen. It makes the patients nervous." He smiled when he said it, to make it land like advice rather than criticism. "I'll work on that," Claire said. Diane mentioned it too. "Thing about your charting, that's not really about the charting. It's a pattern." He shrugged. "Just something to be aware of." Claire folded the rest of her sandwich into its wrapper and stood up. "Thanks, Derek." She didn't go back to the window. She went to find the stairwell door that led to the East Wing service corridor, the one that ran below the main hallway and connected the utility infrastructure for the entire wing. She had found it on her third day, not because she'd been snooping, but because she had gotten turned around after a late handoff and the door had been unlocked, and her feet had taken her through it before her brain made a decision. The service corridor was narrow and lit by fluorescent tubes that buzzed softly. It smelled like floor sealant and recycled air. She had walked it twice since that first accidental visit, memorizing the layout, because memorizing layouts was something she did without choosing to. She had noticed on her second visit that the locked electrical room at the midpoint of the corridor had a new padlock on it. Not the hospital's standard lock. She could see the difference in the hardware. Different lock. Installed recently. This time as she passed it, she heard voices. Stopped. Two men speaking in short, low exchanges. Not English. She stood still for a count of 5, parsing the cadence. Eastern European. She couldn't pin the language further without more. She moved past the door quietly, continued to the far end of the corridor, climbed the service stairs back to the main floor, and stood in the stairwell for a moment with her hand on the railing. She had 2 options. She could report it to hospital security, which would result in a conversation with whoever was in charge of the facility that day, which might or might not go anywhere, and would almost certainly result in questions about why she'd been in the service corridor in the first place. Or she could say nothing, which she was very good at. She said nothing. She returned to her station, finished her charting, and was 15 minutes into the afternoon shift transition when the first explosion hit. It came from below, from the East Wing basement. She understood immediately, even as the building shook and the lights stuttered and every other person on the floor either dove under something or ran for the exit. The ceiling tiles in the hallway buckled. A monitor fell from a rolling cart and shattered. One of the ward secretaries screamed and didn't stop. Claire stood still for exactly 3 seconds, processing. The blast had been directional. The east side of the building had absorbed the primary force she could tell, by the way the wall cracks radiated, by the fact that the windows in the patients' rooms on the right side of the corridor had blown inward, while the ones on the left were intact. Someone had placed the device against a specific structural point. Someone who knew the building's layout. Someone who had been in the service corridor. She was already moving before she finished the thought. The second thing she noticed, pushing against the human current flooding toward the exits, was the exits themselves. The main stairwell at the far end of the hall, the one all her colleagues were running toward, had a door that wasn't opening the way it should. She could see it from 40 feet away. People were pulling, nothing was giving, and the door was outwards swinging, which meant something was blocking it from the other side. Fire exit to the left had a man standing beside it who was not a hospital employee. She knew he wasn't a hospital employee because he was wearing gray tactical gear under an unbuttoned Harlow Peak maintenance jacket, and because he was not evacuating, and because his right hand was resting on something at his hip that was not a walkie-talkie. Claire pivoted left, away from both exits, and went through the door to the supply corridor instead. She needed to think. The explosion had been designed to create panic and direct movement, everyone toward the main exits, which were now compromised. That was a herding strategy. She had seen it before, in places she didn't think about anymore. You blow a single point, you create a single flow, you position your people where the flow leads, which meant there were more of them, which meant this was not random. She moved through the supply corridor and came up through the secondary stairwell to the third floor, where the surgical suite was. The floor was quiet up here. The blast had been far enough below that the structural impact was minimal, and the OR staff were trained to shelter in place during emergencies rather than evacuate. She could hear the distant sound of the fire alarm, which had engaged automatically, and beneath it, something else. Gunshots. 2 floors below her. She stopped counting and started running. Came out through a maintenance door onto the second floor, and nearly walked into a military police officer, pressed against the wall with his weapon drawn, and his radio producing nothing but static. "What floor?" she said. He stared at her. "Ma'am, you need to." "What floor is the secondary assault?" He stared a beat longer then. "First floor east." 3 confirmed armed. Maybe more. Communications went down 60 seconds ago. The high security ward. 4th floor, still locked. "We had 2 officers up there." "Had?" He didn't answer. His jaw was tight. Claire looked at him for 1 second. "Give me your secondary." "Excuse me?" "Your secondary weapon. Whatever you're carrying at the ankle or the vest." He looked at her, like she'd suggested something obscene. "You're a nurse." "I know what I am. Give me a weapon or tell me the fastest route to the 4th floor that doesn't go through the east stairwell." He gave her the route. She took the west stairs 2 at a time, pushed through the 4th floor door, and came out into a corridor that smelled like gunpowder and something copper she recognized and didn't name. 1 military police officer was down at the far end of the hall. Couldn't tell from this distance whether he was alive. The door to the high security ward was closed, but not locked. She could see. The frame was damaged, the electronic lock blown out by what looked like a close-range charge. She approached, low and fast, pressed herself to the wall beside the door, and pushed it open with 1 hand. Inside, Colonel Garrett Voss was sitting upright in his bed. He was a large man, late 50s, with the kind of physical stillness that came not from calm but from discipline. His left arm was in a post-surgical wrap from what the patient census listed as a shoulder reconstruction. His eyes went to her immediately, and in them she saw something that she hadn't expected. Recognition. Not personal recognition, he didn't know her face, but recognition of type. He saw her moving the way she moved, and he understood something that Diane Sutton had never figured out in 3 weeks. "The door," he said. "Lock it. There's a manual bar." She dropped the bar. "How many in the building?" she asked. "Minimum 6. I counted 4 distinct voices in the corridor before comms went down." He was watching her the way she'd been trained to watch a situation, taking inventory. "You're not security. No military?" She didn't answer. "What's your training?" he said. It wasn't aggressive. It was the same question she would have asked. "Get the information you need. Make decisions based on data." "Enough," she said. Something moved behind his eyes. The service tunnel entrance, behind the medication cabinet, leads to the loading dock on the north side. "I can walk. You had shoulder surgery 4 days ago. I've had worse. You'll tear the repair if you put lateral pressure on it." He looked at her. "Then help me not put lateral pressure on it." She crossed the room and looked behind the medication cabinet. He was right there, was a panel, the kind of access hatch that appeared in the building schematics as a utility crawl space. She had not been in this room before. She had not seen the schematics for this floor. She thought briefly about how he knew it was there, and then she set that aside for later. "Before we move," he said, "you need to know why they're here. I need to know if the tunnel is clear. You need to know why." His voice was even but insistent. "'Cause they're not going to stop. Not when we reach the loading dock. Not when we get out of the building. I've been moving for 3 months, and they caught up with me in a hospital bed, which should tell you something about the resources behind this." She turned and looked at him. Really looked. "Blackmore Defense Contractors," he said. "They've been running unauthorized weapons through logistics channels, embedded in legitimate military supply chains. I have the documentation. I was supposed to testify in 9 days." He paused. "The men in this building were sent specifically to stop that from happening." She heard something in the corridor. Footsteps. Deliberate, not panicked. "We're out of time," she said. "Can you stand?" He stood. Cost him something she could see it in the set of his jaw, but he stood. She got the hatch open, looked through, felt the air movement that told her it connected to somewhere real, and turned back to find him already moving toward her. Behind the door, something slammed against the frame, and beneath the sound of splintering wood, Claire heard someone on the other side say her name. Not her rank, not a description. Her name, her actual name. the one on the badge she'd been issued 3 weeks ago. Morrow. She went still for half a second, just half, and then she was moving, getting Voss through the hatch, pulling it closed behind them, dropping into the dark of the service tunnel with her heart rate at 140 and every instinct she'd spent 2 years trying to bury now burning at full volume. They knew exactly who she was, which meant the attack on Harlow Peak Military Medical Center wasn't just about Colonel Garrett Voss. The tunnel was not designed for 2 people moving fast. It was a utility crawl space maybe 4 feet wide, concrete walls slick with condensation, a single strip of emergency lighting running along the ceiling that buzzed and flickered and provided just enough visibility to move without running face first into a junction pipe. Claire went first, one hand on the wall, listening ahead. Voss was behind her, moving better than a man 4 days out of shoulder surgery had any right to, but she could hear the effort in his breathing, controlled, deliberate, kind of patterned exhale that meant he was managing pain rather than not feeling it. "How far?" she said, keeping her voice low. 80 yards. Maybe 90. Turns right at the junction, then a ladder up to the loading dock level. Counted her steps. At 42, she heard something above them, boots on a floor, moving parallel to their direction. She stopped. Voss stopped behind her without being told. The boots paused. Claire didn't breathe. Then the boots moved again, perpendicular now, heading away, and she started moving the moment they did, using their noise to cover hers. She reached the junction, turned right, found the ladder in the dark, by touch. Steel rungs, old paint, the kind of ladder that had been here since the building was constructed and hadn't been inspected since. "Up," she said. "You first," Voss said. "If it holds you, it holds me." She went up. It held. She got to the top, found the hatch, pushed it open 2 inches and looked through. A loading dock concrete floor, rolling steel doors, 2 empty pallets stacked against the far wall, and afternoon light coming through the gap at the bottom of the main door. No movement. She pushed the hatch the rest of the way open and climbed out, then reached back and helped Voss clear the last 2 rungs. He didn't want the help. He took it anyway because he was smarter than his pride. They crossed to the side door, a personnel exit with a push bar, and she eased it open and checked the alley. The gray van was gone from the service lane. She filed that away and moved them out, keeping close to the building's north wall, heading for the tree line at the edge of the hospital property. She had Voss down behind a concrete utility housing and was checking his surgical wrap when she heard the second explosion. This one was different. Not structural, it was smaller, sharper, and it came from somewhere inside the building above the first floor. A room charge, maybe. Something designed to breach a specific barrier. She looked up at the building's east face and saw smoke beginning to push through a window on the second floor, not the fire she'd expected from a structural blast, but a thin, chemical-looking haze that spread and then stopped, like a deliberate deployment. "Smoke," Voss said. "Yes, they're clearing rooms." Yes, she had already understood that. The smoke wasn't for cover, the building was too large for that. It was for pressure. Force the remaining staff and patients toward specific corridors, toward specific exits, toward wherever the Blackmore contractors were waiting. How many staff are still in there? I don't know. She looked at the building. She thought about Diane Sutton, who was infuriating and small-minded and had been working at this hospital for 11 years and had a photograph of a golden retriever on her desk. Thought about Derek Holt, who was arrogant and 26 and had never been told no in his life and probably never would be. Thought about the night shift nurses she passed in the corridor at 6A. M. Handoff and the ward secretary, who always had a crossword puzzle open at the bottom of her monitor. "Can you move on your own?" His eyes sharpened. "Don't. There's a civilian security station on the north side. Should have weapons if it wasn't cleared. You get there. You stay low. You do not transmit because they'll be monitoring hospital frequencies." "I'm not asking." She stood up. "If I'm not back in 40 minutes, you find a way to reach someone outside the communication blackout and you tell them exactly what you told me. You go back in there alone and you're dead." "Maybe." She checked the door she'd come through. Still clear. "But they already know my name, which means they did their homework, which means they know what I used to do, which means they're not sending rookies." She paused. "So at least it'll be a fair fight." Voss stared at her for a long moment. The service corridor. There's an emergency response cabinet outside the security station on the ground floor north side. Standard issue for a facility this size should have a sidearm and a kit. "I know where it is." She went back through the door before he could say anything else. The ground floor north corridor was empty of patients. They'd been evacuated toward the west wing before the communications blackout, which meant the hallway had that particular quality of abandoned urgency. Gurneys left mid-position. IV poles trailing disconnected lines, a call button beeping somewhere with no one to answer it. The emergency response cabinet was where Voss had said, mounted flush to the wall near the security station, its casing intact. She broke the glass with her elbow, which hurt more than it should have, and found a Glock 19 with 2 spare magazines and a first aid kit she didn't need right now. She checked the weapon loaded, chambered safety off, and moved east. She found the first contractor on the main floor junction near the trauma bay. He was moving room to room, checking, not expecting resistance, because he'd been told the building was being cleared without incident. That expectation cost him. She came out of the stairwell behind him, closed the distance before he could turn, and put him down with the kind of efficiency that left nothing to analyze afterward. Took his radio, which confirmed what she'd suspected: they were operating on an encrypted channel, which meant the communication blackout was deliberate and the hospital's own radio systems had been jammed. The radio gave her his team's position reports. 4 inside, 2 confirmed exits, 1 on the roof she hadn't accounted for. She heard something that stopped her. A voice, young, female, not a contractor, coming from behind the closed door of Trauma Bay 2. She pressed against the wall beside it, listened. 2 contractors inside, at least 1 hospital staff member, and from the sound of the exchange, the staff member was being used as leverage over someone else in the room. She opened the door later. She wouldn't be able to fully reconstruct the sequence because it happened too fast for linear memory. What she had was images, a young nurse she recognized from the pediatric ward, Tamsin. Her name was Tamsin, pressed against the far wall with a contractor's arm across her throat. A second contractor turning toward the door, the distance being 12 feet, which was too far for the direct approach she'd intended. She threw the empty first aid kit. It wasn't elegant. It was a metal box moving fast at a man's head, and he ducked, which was the point, and the half-second he spent ducking was the half-second she needed to close the distance. What followed involved the floor and a great deal of noise, and at least one thing breaking that she was fairly certain was not her. When she stood up, both contractors were on the ground. Tamsin was hyperventilating against the wall, and Claire's left forearm had a gash along it that was going to need stitches she didn't have time for. "Can you walk?" she said to Tamsin. Tamsin stared at her. You're Claire, from 4 North. Can you walk?" Yes, I can walk." West corridor, all the way to the end, through the fire door, across the parking lot. "Don't stop," Tamsin went. Claire wrapped her forearm with a strip of gauze from the contractor's own kit, not well, not tightly enough, but enough, and checked the radio again. 4 reports in the last 2 minutes. The team leader, they called him Rook on the channel, was requesting confirmation from the unit that was supposed to be clearing Trauma Bay 2. Silence on that front now. She heard Rook's voice shift register. He knew something was wrong. She needed to move faster. She found the map on the second contractor, a building schematic, folded, with annotations in pencil. She opened it in the hallway light and looked for 10 seconds. The annotations were in English, which told her something about who they'd hired for the inside work. The patient rooms were numbered, but 3 had been circled, and one of those had a time notation beside it: 14:45, 14:51. The room that had been priority circled and time notated was Voss's room, 412. But there was something else. In the margin of the schematic, in handwriting different from the penciled annotations, smaller, neater, more careful, someone had written a room number from the first floor, room 117. And beside it, in the same careful script, confirmed staff, daily 14, 016-0. Claire stared at it. Room 117 was the physician's assistant workroom, where the PA staff did their documentation during mid-afternoon, where Derek Holt most days spent his 2 o'clock hour on his charts. She looked at the handwriting again. She was not a handwriting analyst, but she'd seen enough documentation over 3 weeks to have absorbed the individual patterns of the people around her, the way you absorbed anything when you spent your life paying attention to what other people overlooked. That handwriting was not a contractor's. It was too deliberate, too accustomed to medical charting. The letters formed with the particular economy of someone who wrote the same types of words every day. She folded the map and put it in her pocket. She would deal with that later. First, she had to deal with the remaining contractors. Before Rook figured out he'd lost 2 of his people and changed his operational posture entirely. She found the third one on the 2nd floor east, the same area where she'd heard the boots above the tunnel. He was guarding the main stairwell, positioned with his back to the wall in a way that covered the approach from the left, but left a gap on the right. Because the right side met a bank of windows, he probably thought nobody would come through. She didn't come through the windows. She came up the utility stairwell on the right side, which he wasn't watching, and ended the problem from behind before he could key his radio. 2 left inside, plus the one on the roof she hadn't reached yet. But the radio told her something new. Rook was no longer in the building. He had moved to what the radio called the secondary position, which meant outside the building, which meant he was running the operation from a command point rather than walking the halls himself. Smart. It also meant the remaining 2 inside were holding rather than advancing. They were waiting for Rook's signal, which he hadn't given yet because he was still trying to figure out what had happened to his people. She moved toward the sound of voices. She found them in the East Wing 1st floor, a conference room that had been converted to a holding space. The door was partially open. Inside, 12 hospital staff members sitting on the floor in 2 rows, and 2 armed contractors, one standing by the door and one at the far end of the room, covering the windows. Among the staff members, she could see Diane Sutton, who had her hands in her lap and her posture absolutely rigid, the kind of rigidity that meant she was terrified and refusing to show it. She could see 2 of the surgical nurses from the 3rd floor. She could see a resident physician whose name she didn't know, a young man who looked barely old enough to vote, sitting with his knees drawn up and his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance. She had 1 weapon and 2 targets in a room full of civilians with nowhere to take cover. This was the part where a clean operation would involve waiting for backup, establishing a perimeter, coordinating entry with another unit coming through a secondary point. She had no backup. On the radio, Rook's voice came through, calm and irritated. Sector 2, confirm holding status. Contractor by the door answered immediately. Holding. 17 staff secure 17. She had counted 12 visible. 5 were somewhere she couldn't see from the door gap. She was still processing that when Rook came back with, execute at my mark, changing the timeline. The contractor at the far end of the room straightened. He looked at the one by the door and gave a small nod that Claire had seen before, in other places, with other people, and she understood what it meant before either of them moved. She went through the door. The one by the door was closer. She dealt with him first 2 seconds, brutal and necessary, and was already turning when the one at the far end raised his weapon, and she was not going to reach him in time, and she knew it, and she kept moving anyway. The shot went wide, not because she'd done anything brilliant. He'd fired fast and he'd pulled it because one of the surgical nurses, a woman Claire didn't know, who had been sitting on the floor in the 2nd row, had grabbed his arm with both hands and yanked with everything she had, and the arm had moved 2 inches to the left, and 2 inches was enough. Claire covered the distance and finished it. The room was completely silent for 1 second. Then someone started crying, quiet, exhausted, relief crying rather than fear. The resident physician was on his feet. Several others were standing. Diane Sutton had not moved from her position on the floor. You need to move, Claire said to the room. West corridor, through the fire door, cross the parking lot. Don't stop and don't cluster. Go now. They moved, most of them at least. The surgical nurse who had grabbed the arm, a compact woman in her 40s, with close-cropped hair, and a look on her face she surprised herself, paused beside Claire. He was going to shoot Dr. Aldermean, the woman said. She meant the resident. I saw him look at the doctor. I knew. You did the right thing, Claire said. I've never done anything like that in my life. I know. Go. Diane Sutton was the last one up. She stood, straightened her scrubs with a reflexive, automatic gesture that struck Claire as heartbreaking in its normalcy, and looked at Claire with an expression that Claire couldn't fully read. It wasn't gratitude exactly, and it wasn't the condescension she'd grown used to. It was something more complicated than either. She didn't say anything. She walked out. Claire didn't wait for whatever the moment was going to become. She turned back to the radio. Rook was still broadcasting. Sector 2. Confirm. Sector 2. A pause, and when no answer came, the register shifted again. Sharper now. All units, be advised. We have a problem inside. She clicked the radio twice, a dead air response that could mean signal issue rather than a downed operator, and bought herself maybe 90 seconds. She went for the roof. The roof access was in the north stairwell, a steel door with a push bar at the top of the fourth floor stairs. She took the stairs fast and came through the door into cold afternoon air and found the rooftop contractor with his back to her, watching the parking lot below through a pair of compact field binoculars. He heard the door. He started to turn. She got to him before the turn completed, and it was not clean. He was bigger than the others, faster than she'd expected, and he got an elbow into her ribs that compressed something she was going to feel for a week. She hit the rooftop surface with one knee, lost the sidearm over the edge of a ventilation housing, and finished the fight with two empty hands and the particular controlled fury of someone who had been underestimated so consistently and for so long that it had become a kind of fuel. When it was over, she sat on the rooftop for a moment, breathing. Her ribs hurt. Her forearm was bleeding through the gauze. She was one weapon short. Rook knew something was wrong, which meant his secondary position was going to change, which meant whatever window she had was closing. She found the rooftop contractor's radio on a separate channel from the one she'd been monitoring, a direct line, point to point, and when she keyed it, she heard Rook's voice immediately. "Ledge report." She said nothing. She waited. "Ledge, do not make me come in there." She found the contractor's rifle, which was better than nothing, and looked out over the parking lot from the rooftop edge. The hospital grounds were partially evacuated. She could see clusters of staff and patients at the far end of the parking structure, a distance that suggested they'd gotten at least the ambulatory evacuees out. Ambulances in the lot. 2 police vehicles at the perimeter road, too far out to be immediately useful. And there a dark SUV parked on the service road on the east side, engine running, windows tinted. The secondary position. She watched it. After 30 seconds, the driver's door opened. A man got out. Not large, not small, the kind of physical nondescriptness that was itself a trained quality, wearing dark civilian clothing that didn't suggest military, but moved in a way that did. He stood beside the vehicle and looked up at the building. He was looking for his team. He didn't find them. He took out a phone, not a radio. A phone, which meant he was making a call to someone outside the immediate operation, and turned slightly away from the building while he dialed. Claire memorized everything she could from this distance. The vehicle. The plates, which she couldn't quite read from here, but could get 3 characters of. The man's build, height, the specific way he stood with his weight slightly forward, the habit of a person trained to be ready to move. Then he looked up, not at the building generally, at the roof, directly at her. She had not expected the angle to be right for visibility. She was back from the edge. The afternoon light was behind her, but he looked up and he was still, and she was still, and across 200 feet of open air, he tilted his head in a way that was not confusion and not surprise. She had never seen this man before in her life. She was certain of that. She had a good memory for faces, and this face was not in it. But he looked at her with the specific quality of someone confirming a fact they already knew. He got back into the SUV. Claire came off the roof at a run. She took the stairs 4 at a time, hit the second-floor landing, pivoted toward the east wing, and came out through the side door into the parking area in time to see the SUV pulling out of the service road, moving north, not accelerating dramatically, just leaving, steady and deliberate. She watched it go. She had the 3 plate characters. She had his build and his face, and the way he moved. She had the radio channel he'd used, and the fact that he'd made a phone call when his team went silent. She had the handwritten annotation on the schematic in her pocket, and she had a growing cold certainty that nothing about this operation had been improvised. Precision of the device placements, the communication blackout that required hardware inside the building systems, installed before the attack, the knowledge of staff schedules, of which exits to block, of which floors to clear, and which to hold. The annotations on the schematic that matched the handwriting of someone who charted patient notes every afternoon. Someone had fed this operation everything it needed, from inside. She was still standing at the edge of the parking lot, rifle in hand, when she heard the first military vehicles coming. 3 of them, moving fast from the South Access Road, carrying federal insignia she recognized and hadn't expected to see this far from anything that wasn't classified. They came in hard and stopped in a formation that told her the people inside knew exactly what they were arriving to. A woman got out of the lead vehicle first. Late 40s, silver at the temples, wearing the kind of civilian professional clothing that didn't disguise the posture underneath it. She had a federal ID on a lanyard and a look on her face that said she'd been in transit since before the first explosion. She saw Claire. She walked directly toward her, ignoring everything else in the lot. "Claire Morrow," the woman said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Director Sloan, Federal Threat Assessment. We need to talk about the man who just left in that vehicle." She paused. "His name is Volkov, and you are the reason he came here today." Claire looked at the woman. She looked at the building behind her. She thought about Derek Holt's careful handwriting in the margin of a tactical schematic that no hospital employee should have ever seen. "I know," she said. Director Sloan's expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "You know, I figured most of it out in the last hour." Claire lowered the rifle. "What I don't know is how long you've been tracking this, and why nobody told me I was a target before I walked into a hospital and nearly got 17 people killed." Sloan looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the federal agents were moving into the building, efficient and coordinated, the kind of entry that came from briefing rather than improvisation. "That," Sloan said quietly, "is a conversation we should have had 6 months ago. We're having it now." "Yes." Sloan glanced at Claire's forearm, where the gauze was fully saturated and blood had traced a thin line to her wrist. "After someone looks at that." "After the conversation." Sloan studied her. "You really did serve with the 3rd CSR unit." "Question?" "It's a confirmation." A pause. "The file said you were exceptional." "The file undersold it." She looked toward the entrance the federal team had taken. "Volkov has been active for 14 months. He's ex-Russian military, private contractor, current employee of Blackmore Defense. 3 months ago, we intercepted communications suggesting he had been assigned a personal target, someone connected to our Colonel Voss investigation. We didn't know the target's identity until 4 days ago." Claire waited. "The target was you," Sloan said, "not Voss." Voss was already compromised. They knew about his testimony. "There's something in Blackmore's operational records that connects to your unit. Something from your last deployment. Something they cannot afford to have surfaced." The afternoon had gone cold around them. In the distance, she could hear the federal team moving through the building, room by room, conducting the clearing she hadn't been able to finish. She could hear ambulances. She could hear the sound of people who had survived something they hadn't expected to survive, beginning the slow, noisy process of understanding that. Thought about a locked electrical room with a new padlock. She thought about a gray van that sat in a service lane for 4 hours and then was gone. She thought about a man on a rooftop who had looked at her across 200 feet of air with the face of someone reading a file, not meeting a stranger. She thought about the 6 years she'd spent trying to disappear. "How much do they know?" she said. "Enough to send 9 contractors into an active military medical facility in broad daylight." Sloan met her eyes. "Which means they know you're harder to get rid of quietly." They stopped trying quiet. Claire stood there in the cold parking lot of a hospital she'd worked at for 3 weeks, with a weapon in one hand and blood drying on the other, and felt the particular sensation of a door she had locked very carefully opening from the other side. "Where is Volkov now?" she said. "We lost the vehicle at the North Junction. We have the plates. They'll be switched within 20 minutes. Sloan paused. "He'll make contact again. He always does. I know." Claire looked at the building one more time. Thought about the map in her pocket. Thought about neat, careful handwriting in the margin of a page that shouldn't exist. "Before we go any further with Volkov, there's something you need to know about someone inside this hospital." Sloan waited. "Whoever fed Blackmore the staff schedules, the security layout, the patient census, they used handwriting in their annotations. Old habit, paper backup. Which means they've been doing this long enough to have operational discipline about leaving digital trails." Claire reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded schematic. "And they weren't careful enough about one thing." She handed it over. Sloan unfolded it, looked at the annotations, and then looked at the margin notation in the smaller, more deliberate script. "You know whose handwriting this is?" Sloan said. Again, not a question. "Think so. I need you to confirm it." Sloan looked at the room number. 117. Daily, 14, 0160. "Who works that room at that hour?" Claire told her. Sloan was quiet for a moment. Around them, the late afternoon had turned orange and cold, and the emergency vehicles were still moving, and somewhere inside the building was calling, "Clear, clear, clear," down the halls that smelled like smoke and adrenaline and the particular aftermath of violence. He's been with this hospital for 2 years, Sloan said. Clean record, good evaluations. I know. He would have access to everything on that schematic. I know that too. Sloan folded the schematic carefully. This is going to complicate the investigation significantly. Yes, Claire said. It is. She said it without satisfaction. There was no satisfaction in it, just the cold, flat acknowledgement of a thing she'd suspected for the last 20 minutes and wished she was wrong about, because being right meant that the people who had walked into this hospital this afternoon had been handed the keys from the inside, and that the cheerful, arrogant young man who had told her she moved like she was expecting something bad to happen had known, when he said it, exactly what was coming. Derek Holt was arrested at 5:47 p.m. in the hospital's west parking structure, sitting in his car with his engine running, and a bag on the passenger seat that contained a change of clothes, $11,000 in cash, and a prepaid phone with 3 numbers in the contacts, none of which belonged to anyone at Harlow Peak Military Medical Center. Claire wasn't there when it happened. She was in the mobile medical unit the federal team had deployed in the parking lot, getting her forearm sutured by a federal medic named Okafor, who worked fast and didn't make conversation, which she appreciated. She heard the arrest over Sloan's Radio 2 agents, West Structure, subject in custody, no resistance, and she sat with that for a moment while Okafor tied off the last stitch. No resistance. Of course not. Derek Holt had never been in a situation where resistance was the calculation. He had been the kind of person for whom systems worked, for whom doors opened, for whom the gap between deciding to do something and having it done was small and frictionless. He had sold the hospital's security layout and staff schedules and patient census to a private defense contractor for money, and he had probably told himself it was complicated, that the situation was complicated. He was not the kind of person who did things like this, even while he was doing it. She had stitches in her forearm and cracked ribs, and she was tired in a way that was structural rather than physical, and she found she couldn't generate the anger she expected to feel about Derek Holt. What she felt instead was something closer to a flat, exhausted recognition. She had known people like him in other places, the ones who cooperated with the wrong side, not out of conviction, but out of calculation, out of a small, careful reading of the odds that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Done, Okafor said, taping the dressing. Ribs? Bruised. Maybe one cracked, nothing displaced. He looked at her. You want imaging? No. He looked like he had an opinion about that, kept it to himself, and started packing his kit. Director Sloan came through the unit's rear door a minute later and sat down on the equipment bench across from Claire with the look of someone who had been awake since before this started and was going to be awake long after it ended. She had a tablet in her hand. She set it on the bench between them, without a word, and let Claire look at the screen. Personnel file. Military. The photograph was Claire's, from 7 years ago, younger face, same eyes, the particular flat camera expression of an official photograph taken when you had learned not to give anything away, even to a lens. Below the photo, unit designation, classification level, operational theater. The specific designation of the unit she had served with, the one that didn't appear in standard military databases, the one whose existence was acknowledged by exactly 3 documents in the federal system, and none of them were accessible. Without a clearance, she no longer technically held. Blackmore has a copy of this, Sloan said. Claire looked up from the tablet. We don't know yet. Holt didn't have clearance to access this file. Nobody at Harlow Peak did. Which means the breach happened somewhere else, upstream, before Holt was ever involved. Sloan pulled the tablet back. What we do know is that Volkov was given this file specifically. He wasn't assigned to neutralize Voss and incidentally found you in the building. He was assigned to you. Voss was the mechanism, the reason to come to this hospital, the cover operation. You were the objective. Claire was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the ongoing federal presence vehicles, radio traffic, the sound of the investigation beginning its long, procedural work. The hospital's east wing was cordoned off. The patients who could be moved had been moved. The ones who couldn't were being managed by a skeletal staff under federal supervision. What's in my operational file that Blackmore can't afford to have surfaced? She said. It wasn't quite a question. Your last deployment. Syria 6 years ago. Sloan's voice was careful. Your unit recovered documents from a logistics depot outside Deir ez-Zor. Those documents included procurement records, weapons contracts, supply chain authorizations, payment records. Some of those records connected to Blackmore subsidiaries operating under shell company designations. She paused. Those documents were cataloged, classified, and submitted to the DoD Inspector General's office. And then they disappeared. Disappeared. The submission was received. The records show receipt. The documents themselves are no longer in the system. Sloan met her eyes. Someone pulled them. And whoever pulled them is very motivated to ensure that the people who originally found those documents cannot reconstruct or testify to what they contained. Claire sat with that 6 years. She had spent 6 years building a small, quiet life in a series of cities where nobody knew her name or her history, and she had thought not naively, she had thought about it carefully, that the distance was enough. That whatever operational exposure she carried, the documents themselves would serve as the primary target, and once the documents were gone, so was the threat. She had been wrong, because what she carried wasn't just knowledge of what the documents said. She had written the field report. She had handled the physical procurement records. She had, in the particular and legally significant way that military intelligence worked, been a chain of custody witness to evidence that implicated Blackmore's predecessor companies in weapons trafficking that had killed people in 3 countries. She was the evidence. "The other members of my unit," she said. Sloan's expression told her before the words did. "We're locating them. 2 are confirmed safe they left service and felt sufficient distance. 1 is deceased, unrelated causes, 14 months ago, a pause that carried weight. 4th member of your unit has been missing for 6 weeks. Claire kept her face still. "Reyes, Marcus Reyes, yes. Former Staff Sergeant, 3rd CSR. He dropped out of contact in March. We've had a missing persons flag on him for 3 weeks, but it was filed through civilian channels. Nobody connected it to Blackmore until today." Stood up, stop. Okafor looked at her, and she looked back at him, and he moved slightly to the left to get out of her way. "I need everything you have on Volkov's current operational pattern," she said. "Safe houses, vehicles, known associates, everything. Morrow, and I need to know where Reyes was last tracked. Last cell ping, last financial transaction, last anything." She was already at the door. "You said Volkov makes contact again. He always does. If he took Reyes, it's not to keep him, it's to use him. Which means there's a timeline." Sloan stood. "I can't authorize an independent operations, then authorize a consultation. Call it whatever makes the paperwork work." She looked at the woman directly. "You came here with federal backup and a file that's been open for 14 months, and Volkov still walked out of this parking lot this afternoon. I'm not criticizing, I'm telling you what the situation is." She pushed the door open. "He knew to look for me on the roof. He knew what I looked like, how I'd been positioned, probably how I'd think, which means he's studied my file the way I'm going to study his. That's the only advantage I have right now. He already thinks he knows what I'll do." Sloan was quiet for 3 seconds. "The advanced team has a mobile command set up in the north lot. I'll have the Volkov file transferred to your access in 20 minutes. 15, Claire said, and went out into the cold. The Volkov file was thicker than she'd expected and more useful than she'd hoped. Viktor Volkov, 43 years old, former Russian military intelligence, left service 12 years ago under circumstances the file described as voluntary separation in the clipped bureaucratic language that meant something significantly less voluntary had occurred. 4 years with a European private security firm. Then Blackmore. Indirectly, he appeared in their operational records as a contracted asset, never a direct employee, the corporate equivalent of keeping your hands clean. 3 confirmed operations attributed to him in the last 4 years, all of them in the category of target elimination with collateral managed, meaning he had killed people and he had been good enough at it that the bodies were found and the evidence was not. File noted his preference for what the analysts called environmental integration. He didn't come in with weapons unless he had to. Preferred situations, circumstances, accidents. The hospital attack was a departure from his method, which told her something about the urgency Blackmore was feeling. How badly they wanted both Voss and her account neutralized before the testimony date. She worked through the file in the mobile command unit for 2 hours, while the federal team processed the hospital scene around her. At 9:15 p.m., Sloan came in with fresh intelligence. A cell signal, attributed to one of Volkov's known associate numbers, had been picked up twice in the last 4 hours, both in the corridor east of Casper, moving toward the Powder River Basin. At 9:40, the phone Claire had taken from the rooftop contractor, which the federal tech team had been processing, produced something that stopped everything in the room. A message sent and received before the attack, from a number that the tech analyst flagged immediately. The message itself was short, operational, not particularly revealing. But the number it had been sent to was in the federal system under a different context entirely. It was a contact associated with a legitimate medical conference coordinator out of Denver named Dr. Naomi Carrasco, a trauma surgeon who had no known connection to Blackmore or Volkov or anything related to the investigation. The analyst explained it to Sloan while Claire listened. The number had been spoofed. The actual message had been routed through Carrasco's contact number as a relay point. Standard operational security, the kind of thing you did when you wanted a clean intercept record. But the spoofing had been imperfect. The metadata trail led somewhere. She's being used as a relay without her knowledge, the analyst said. It's actually sophisticated. They picked a number that would look legitimate in any call record audit. Where is she now? Sloan said. She was at a trauma surgery conference in Denver through yesterday. Flew back to Casper this morning. She's a staff surgeon at the analyst checked his screen. Harlow Peak Military Medical Center. The room went quiet. Claire looked at Sloan. She's on staff, Claire said. Means Volkov has her information, her schedule, her address, her patterns. Same way they had everyone else's. Sloan was already reaching for her radio. Get me a location on Carrasco now. The answer came back in 4 minutes. Naomi Carrasco had left her apartment at 7 p.m. and had not returned. Her neighbor had seen a dark vehicle outside. The neighbor thought she'd gotten into it willingly, but wasn't certain. The room moved fast after that. Sloan had units redirecting. The analyst was pulling everything on Carrasco, her address, her vehicle, her last cell ping. The last cell ping was bad. It was stationary, south of the city, in an industrial area near the old consolidated freight processing plant that had been closed for 2 years. Claire was already at the door. Wait, Sloan said. She's a hostage. She's a message. Claire turned. Took her because he knew you'd track the number, and he knew I'd see the file, and he knows how I think. This is him making contact. Sloan studied her. He wants you at that location. Yes, then we flood it. Tactical team, full approach. Carrasco is dead before they're in the gate. She kept her voice flat. He's had enough time to establish position. He'll have sightlines on every approach road. Tactical convoy shows up. He doesn't wait. She looked at Sloan steadily. He wants me. So I go. That is not alone, she said, because she'd been thinking about this since the analyst said the plant's location. Voss said he had a team. Former special operations. The people who've been supporting his move through the federal system. Where are they? Sloan hesitated 1 beat too long. Sloan, where is Voss's team? They're secured. They've been cooperating with the investigations. They're cooperating or they're detained. Another beat. Both. Release them to me. 4 people, small approach. Nothing that reads as federal on the access roads. She watched Sloan calculate. I know what I'm walking into. That's the advantage. I'm the only person in this situation who has studied Volkov's file and also been inside whatever is in his file on me. We know how each other thinks. That's either the worst possible variable or the most useful one. Sloan made a decision. Claire could see it happened, not a comfortable decision. Not one Sloan was going to put in a report without careful language, but a real one made by someone who understood what the situation actually required rather than what procedure preferred. Take the team. One fed Okafor, he's got tactical training. Communications stay open, full audio. Sloan held her gaze. You do not engage until Carrasco is clear of the building. Non-negotiable. Understood. She understood it. Whether she could honor it depended on what she found when she got there. The consolidated freight plant was a low, sprawling structure that had once processed regional shipping through the Powder River Basin and now sat behind a chain-link fence with weeds coming through the asphalt and windows that had been boarded and then unboarded and then ignored. Kind of place that appeared on no one's priority list. Kind of place that had multiple points of ingress that showed on no current map because the facility plans in the county database were 15 years out of date. Claire had Voss's team, a man named Garrett, who had served with the colonel since before the current situation and had the specific quiet of someone very good at staying alive, and 2 others whose names she didn't have yet, but whose professional discipline was visible in the way they moved through the dark toward the facility's northeast corner. Okafor was on her left, radio on minimal transmit, watching the access road behind them. She'd done 3 circuits of the facility layout in the 40 minutes she'd had between leaving the mobile command unit and arriving at the staging point in the dark. She had the plant schematic from the county records incomplete, but better than nothing, and she had Garrett, who had driven past the facility twice in the last 2 months as part of the operational security work he'd been doing for Voss. "Loading dock," Garrett said quietly, crouched beside her, behind equipment housing 40 meters from the fence line. North face. That door was replaced in the last 6 months, different material. You can see it in the light difference. Someone's been using this facility recently. Volkov got here ahead of us. He's had time to establish. She looked at the building. 3 windows on the north face showed faint light, not artificial lighting, something portable, battery-powered. He'll have Carrasco somewhere centrally located, not near an exterior wall too easy to extract without engaging him. "What does he want from you?" Garrett said. "A conversation. He wants to tell me something before She stopped. Recalibrated. "He wants me to understand what I'm walking into. It's his profile. He's a deliberate person. He's not going to kill me without making sure I know why." Garrett looked at her sideways. "That's not comforting. It gives us time." She worked out the approach. "2 of you on the south face. Find whatever secondary ingress exists. Hold position until I have contact. Okafor, northeast corner. Maintain sight on the loading dock. Garrett, you're with me." She went over the fence first. The northeast corner of the building had a personnel door that had been opened recently. She could tell by the disturbed rust pattern at the base of the frame. Garrett checked it for contact charges while she covered the approach, and then they were inside. The interior of the plant was large, dark, and full of the particular smell of industrial abandonment oil residue and old concrete and something chemical she couldn't immediately identify. She moved through it by the available light, which wasn't much, letting her eyes adjust and listening to the building around her. Old structures talked when people moved through them. The sound changed. The air moved differently. Heat sources created micro-variations in the acoustics. She heard something on the left side, deeper in. Not movement, something electrical. Portable light source or a heating unit, the kind of thing you brought in when you were planning to stay somewhere for more than a few hours. She found the interior wall of the old loading management office, which was elevated slightly from the main floor, still enclosed, its windows intact. Light came from the gap under the door. She was 10 feet from it when the door opened. A man came out, not Volkov, one of his people, large and moving with his weapon up before he'd fully cleared the frame. She and Garrett split left and right by instinct, and it was close, too close. The sound of it's much louder than she would have wanted inside the building. Garrett handled his side of it. Claire handled hers, and when the noise stopped, she stood for a moment, with her heart at 160, and her forearm throbbing where the stitches had pulled with the impact. Garrett looked at her. "The ribs? Fine, they weren't fine." She kept moving. Inside the office, Naomi Carrasco, seated, wrists zip-tied to the arm of a metal chair, a cut on her forehead that had bled and mostly stopped. She was conscious, and she was looking at the door with the expression of someone who had been holding herself together for hours by sheer refusal. "No, Volkov." Claire crossed to her immediately, cut the zip ties with the knife from the contractor's kit she still carried, and looked at the head wound. Superficial. The bleeding was dried. Her pupils were equal and reactive when Claire put a light on them. "Can you walk?" Claire said. "Yes. I've been saying I can walk to myself for 4 hours." Carrasco's voice was steady, shaken underneath it but steady on top. "Where is he?" "Not here." Claire was already thinking about what that meant. She helped Carrasco up, assessed her steadiness good, better than it should be, and looked at Garrett. "Get her out." "Northeast door, hand her to Okafor, stay on the building." Garrett moved. Carrasco went with him, and Claire spent exactly 3 seconds watching them clear the frame before she turned around. Volkov had left Carrasco here as a delivery mechanism. She had known that she had set it to Sloan in the command unit, but she had assumed it meant he would be here to receive. He had left a guard but not stayed himself, which meant either he had changed his approach or her radio clicked twice. Okafor's signal. Something on the access road. She moved to the window on the north side of the office and looked out through the dirty glass. The access road was clear, but there was a light, brief, directional, the kind of light put up by a phone screen, at a distance from the tree line on the east side of the facility. He was outside. He had been watching the building. He had watched her go in. She took the stairs down from the office to the main floor and moved toward the east face of the building, toward the loading bay doors that were rusted and partially open. She came through the gap into the cold night air and stopped. Volkov was 40 feet away, standing in the open, which was not what she'd expected, with no weapon visible, which was also not what she'd expected. He was of average height, lean, with the kind of weathered stillness that came from operating outdoors for years, in conditions that eroded everything non-essential. He looked older in person than his file photograph. The file said 43. He looked 50. Whatever the work had cost him, it showed. "I'm not going to shoot you," he said. His English was precise and unaccented, the kind of fluency that came from years rather than classes. "I'm not interested in your intentions." She kept the weapon level. "I need you to listen to something." He took a slow step to the left, into slightly better light, and she adjusted her position to maintain the sight line. "What's in your operational file from Syria Blackmore isn't just protecting a weapons contract. There is a name in those procurement records. One name specifically that connects the Deir ez-Zor Depot operation to a sitting official in the federal defense procurement infrastructure." She kept her face neutral. "I know because I processed the contract," he said. "I was the logistics liaison for that operation. I moved the weapons. And the name that authorized the payments is the same name that has been running interference on every investigation into Blackmore for the last 4 years." He paused. "Including yours." The night around them was very quiet. "You're telling me the investigation has been compromised from inside federal procurement," she said. "I'm telling you the person running interference is not a Blackmore employee." He met her eyes across the 40 feet between them. "They're in the office that has been investigating Blackmore." Processed that for exactly 2 seconds before she heard Garrett's voice in her earpiece, calm, clipped, the specific register of someone delivering information they wish they weren't delivering. "Morrow, vehicle on the South Road. Multiple, they're not ours." And in the same moment, her radio, the open channel to Sloan's command unit, went dead. She made the decision in under 2 seconds. "Volkov. Inside. Now." He looked at her for one beat, assessing whether this was a trap. She could see him running it, and then he moved, because whatever else he was a professional, and professionals recognized when the threat calculus had shifted. She came in behind him through the loading bay gap, pulled the rusted door as far closed as it would go, and keyed her earpiece. "Garrett, how many vehicles? 2. Moving slow. No headlights." A pause. "It's not federal. Federal doesn't run dark on an access road. Where's Carrasco clear?" "She's with Okafor, East Tree Line, 200 meters out. Stay with them. Do not engage. Move north along the tree line and keep moving until you have signal, then reach in Sloan through any channel that works." She looked at Volkov in the dark interior of the plant. "The radio blackout, that's not Blackmore." "No," Volkov said. "Procurement contact. They have federal-grade jamming capability, which means they knew about this operation. They've known about every operation for 4 years. His voice was flat, not apologetic, the tone of someone delivering facts they find distasteful rather than shameful. They have access to Director Sloan's communications. Not all of it enough. They knew she was moving on this facility tonight. Absorb that. It had implications she didn't have time to fully map right now. How many are coming? The people in those vehicles are not contractors. They're not like the team at the hospital. He paused. They're domestic. Connected to the infrastructure around the procurement office, kind of people who don't exist on paper. She understood what he meant. Not mercenaries, fixers. Kind of operational capacity that existed inside bureaucratic structures for exactly this purpose when the mercenaries failed and the situation needed to be resolved with the kind of thoroughness that left no useful evidence behind. "You said you have the name," she said. "The procurement official." "Yes." "Is it documented? Can you prove it?" "I have documentation." "It's not here." He held her gaze. "It's in a location I set up 3 months ago when I understood the Blackmore operation was being shut down from the inside, and I was going to be the one they used to clean it up. You were going to be the cleanup, and you became the cleaner. I was the cleaner until I found out who gave the original authorization. After that," he stopped. Something shifted in his expression that was not quite regret, but was adjacent to it. After that, the calculation changed. She heard something outside. Not vehicles' footsteps. More than 2 people, moving along the building's south face. "There's a fire door on the west face," she said. "Behind the old conveyor housing. Behind the main floor. Go. You're not coming. I need 60 seconds. Go." She moved to the south-face interior wall and found a position behind a collapsed section of industrial shelving that had fallen years ago and was now a useful angle of cover. She waited. The door, a personnel door she'd noted on entry, its frame corroded, opened slowly, and she watched two men come through it with the specific care of people who expected resistance but weren't certain of the form it would take. She gave them something to look at on the left side of the room by kicking a section of loose conduit pipe and then moving right in the noise it created. They both tracked left. She dealt with the nearer one while his attention was wrong, and the second one fired once before she reached him, and the round went into the concrete ceiling and produced a sound that was going to bring everyone outside to this side of the building immediately. She didn't have 60 seconds anymore. She went through the west fire door and found Volkov 20 meters out in the dark, moving toward a section of the perimeter fence where the chain link had separated from its post. Caught up with him, got through the gap, and they were in open scrubland, moving away from the facility, when she heard the building behind them come alive with movement and light. She ran for 3 minutes, which was not comfortable with the ribs, and then pulled Volkov down behind a drainage cut in the terrain and listened. The pursuit was disorganized. She could hear it in the pattern, multiple people moving without a coordinated signal system, which meant they'd lost their command radio when the jamming went up and were operating on visual contact only. The documentation, she said, breathing through the rib pain. Where Casper? A storage unit off Highway 20. Unit 47. He said it without her having to press further, which told her he'd already decided to give it to her before tonight. That this had been the plan when he took Carrasco to draw her here and give her this. There's a key. Tell me about the name first, he told her. She sat in the drainage cut with cold ground under her and listened to Viktor Volkov explain how a senior deputy director in the Federal Defense Procurement Oversight Office, a man named Raymond Cassell, who had been in the position for 9 years and had oversight authority over the inspector general process for exactly the procurement sector Blackmore operated in, had been on Blackmore's payroll since, before her unit ever found those documents in Syria, not directly on the payroll. Through a series of financial instruments she wouldn't be able to untangle without forensic accountants, routed through a foundation, through a real estate holding entity, through a legitimate investment account that was slightly too consistently profitable for its stated strategy. Cassell had pulled the Syria documents from the Inspector General's system. Cassell had been feeding operational intelligence to Blackmore's security division for years. Cassell was the reason 4 years of federal investigation had produced charges against minor contractors and left the organization's core intact. Cassell, this was the part that made the cold ground feel colder, had authorized the resources that were now moving through the scrubland behind them. He's not running this, Volkov said. He's approving it. The operational execution is someone below him, someone who stays further from the decisions. But the authorization comes from Cassell's office. How long have you known? 11 months. He said it, without flinching from what it implied. 11 months, during which he had continued to operate for Blackmore while knowing this, which was not a clean history. I needed the documentation before I could move. It took time to build the record without him knowing I was building it. And the hospital attack. You were there. You saw me on the roof. I was running the operation, yes. A pause. I want you to understand Carrasco was not supposed to be harmed. The hostages were a pressure mechanism, not a, I understand what they were. Her voice was flat. Doesn't change what happened. He accepted that. No, it doesn't. She looked out over the dark scrubland. Behind them, the pursuit had spread wider, which meant they were losing the precise location and casting a broader net, which bought time and also meant the net was getting larger. I need to reach Sloan outside the compromised channels. I have a burner in my jacket. It's clean, never connected to any number in the Blackmore system. She took it. She had a number in her memory that she hadn't dialed in years, a contact number from her operational period, a back channel that had nothing to do with federal infrastructure and everything to do with the informal network that special operations units maintained outside official systems. She didn't know if the number still worked. It worked. 3 rings, then a voice she recognized, older now, rougher at the edges. Who is this? Morrow, 3rd CR. I need a relay to Director Sloan, FTA, bypassing her primary channels. I have evidence of an active federal compromise at the deputy director level in defense procurement oversight. I need it documented in the next 20 minutes before the people running the cover operation get to the physical evidence. A long pause. Say the name Cassell. Raymond Cassell. Another pause longer. Then give me 8 minutes. She gave him 8 minutes, spent 4 of them moving with Volkov to a better position further from the facility, and spent the remaining 4 listening to the pursuit sounds diminish as whoever was running the ground operation started pulling back. Either they'd lost the trail completely, or someone above them had given a stand down, concerned about exposure in open terrain. When the relay came through, Sloane's voice was tight and clipped, and carried the particular quality of someone who had just been told something that rearranged a large portion of what they thought they knew. Morrow, are you safe? For the moment. I have Volkov. A beat. He's cooperating. He has documentation on Cassell. Physical. In storage. Unit 47. On Highway 20. You need a team there now. Before whoever is running Castle's ground operation figures out what we have. She paused. Your communications were compromised. Cassell's people have been monitoring your operational channel. Whatever you authorized tonight, they knew before your team moved. The silence on the line was brief but heavy. I need you to bring Volkov in, Sloane said. I will. After the storage unit is secured, she kept her voice level. I don't want Cassell's people reaching that documentation first because we moved Volkov before we locked the evidence. Another beat. Sloane was calculating. Claire could almost feel it through the line. The weight of a decision made in real time, with insufficient information and too much at stake. I'll have a team at the storage unit in 15 minutes, Sloane said. Where are you? She gave coordinates. Morrow, a pause. The deputy director has been in his position for 9 years. I know. I know what it's going to do. She looked at Volkov, who was watching her from 4 feet away with the patient attention of someone waiting to see whether the next hour of his life would be better or worse than the last 4 years. That's the point. Raymond Cassell was arrested at 11:43 p.m. at his residence in the Bethesda area of Maryland. Claire was not there. She was in a federal processing facility outside Casper, with bruised ribs and a sutured forearm and a cup of coffee she'd been given an hour ago and was only now drinking because she'd finally stopped moving long enough for her hands to be still. Garrett was across the room talking to a federal agent with the quiet, cooperative efficiencies of someone who had been expecting this kind of evening for a long time and was relieved to be on the finishing side of it. Naomi Carrasco had been transported to a civilian hospital for observation and the head wound, and the last report Claire had received said she was stable and furious, which seemed about right. Volkov was in a separate room. The arrangement was complicated. He had committed acts that were going to require extended legal processing regardless of his cooperation, and the cooperation was significant, but not unlimited in what it could offset. She had made no promises to him about outcomes. She had told him she would represent accurately what he'd given them. That was all she could honestly offer. Sloane came in at midnight with the look of someone who had made 17 consequential phone calls in the last hour and was about to make 4 more. The documentation checks out, she said, sitting down across from Claire without preamble. Forensic accounting is going to take weeks to fully map the financial instruments, but the direct payment records Volkov preserved are sufficient for an immediate arrest warrant. She set a tablet on the table between them. On it was a photograph, the processing intake photograph, taken an hour ago, of a man in his early 60s with silver hair, and the specific expression of someone who had believed, until very recently, that the systems he operated within would protect him from exactly this outcome. Cassell looked smaller than his position. They usually did. He's lawyering up aggressively, Sloane said. That's expected. What's not expected is that 2 of his staff members contacted our office voluntarily in the last 40 minutes. She paused. He's been managing the intelligence flow on Blackmore for 9 years. Apparently some of the people around him have been uncomfortable with that for a significant portion of that time, and have been waiting for someone to open the door. People cooperate when they think the outcome is fixed, Claire said. When it looks like the wall's already coming down, people stop standing in front of it. Yes. Sloane looked at her. Blackmore's legal team has been contacted. Their response, and this came through in the last 20 minutes, is that they are preparing to cooperate fully with the investigation and that they are reviewing the actions of specific contracted assets that operated outside sanctioned parameters. Claire almost laughed. They're going to say Volkov went rogue. That appears to be the opening position, yes. Their executives authorized the hospital attack. Procurement records Volkov preserved include authorization documentation from Blackmore's Internal Security Division. I know. They don't know what we have yet. Sloane's expression was the particular satisfaction of someone who held more cards than the other side knew existed. By the time their legal team finishes the meeting they've requested, they'll know. Claire drank the rest of the coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Reyes, she said. Sloane's expression shifted. Marcus Reyes was located 6 hours ago. He's alive. He's been held in a secondary location, a remote property outside Douglas, Wyoming, that Blackmore's Operational Security Division used as a staging point. She watched Claire carefully. He's in poor condition, but he's coherent and he's going to recover. Claire put the cup down. She kept her face still because the alternative was something she didn't want to do in a federal processing facility with Sloane watching. He held out, Sloane said quietly. Whatever they asked him for, he held. She nodded once. Didn't say anything. He asked about you, Sloane said, when the extraction team reached him. First thing he asked. She managed. What did they tell him? That you were the reason they knew where to find him. Processing facility was quiet around them. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. A radio crackled briefly and went silent. Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and clear, and the investigation was still moving, would be moving for months, following the threads that Volkov's documentations had exposed, pulling on the connections between Castle's office and Blackmore's financial instruments and shell companies that had moved weapons through legitimate logistics chains for years. But in this room at this moment, the thing that had been running for 6 years had stopped. Derek Holt's arraignment was 4 days later. Claire didn't attend. She had no formal standing in the criminal proceeding and nothing useful to contribute to the arraignment itself. The evidence was documentary and testimonial, and it didn't need her in a courtroom to exist. But she read the coverage, sitting in the temporary quarters she'd been assigned at the federal facility while the larger investigation processed, and she read it with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered. He had been charged with conspiracy, providing material support to a criminal enterprise, and 2 counts related to the deaths that had occurred during the hospital attack. The military police officer, who had been killed in the 4th floor corridor, and a security guard, whose name Claire now knew was Dennis Farrow, 41 years old, who had worked at Harlow Peak for 7 years and had a wife and a daughter in her 2nd year of high school. Dennis Farrow had died because Derek Holt had sold the security rotation schedules, and Farrow had been in a position he wouldn't otherwise have been in, at a time the contractors had known in advance, because of information Holt had provided. The arraignment reporting noted that Holt had entered a not guilty plea, and that attorney had stated his client was eager to demonstrate his innocence. It also noted, further down, that 2 of the contracted operators who had survived the hospital incident had already entered cooperation agreements, and that their statements included specific references to the inside contact whose information had made the operation viable. Claire set down the tablet. She thought about Holt's voice in the break room. You move like you're somewhere else, like you're always half expecting something bad to happen. He had known when he said that something bad was already arranged. He had been carrying that knowledge through every interaction, every correction, every casual professional exchange in the corridors of that hospital. She wondered if he'd been afraid. She decided it didn't matter. The federal investigative hearings began 10 days after Cassell's arrest. They were closed classified, restricted to cleared personnel and legal counsel, but the fact of their existence was not classified. And by the 3rd day, the reporting had enough detail for anyone paying attention to understand the shape of what was being disclosed. A deputy director in federal defense procurement oversight, 9 years of compromised intelligence, 4 years of active interference in a criminal investigation, financial instruments totaling an amount that the preliminary forensic accounting placed north of $4 million. Blackmore's legal repositioning the rogue contracted asset defense they'd telegraphed through their initial response collapsed within 48 hours of the first hearing session when the prosecution presented Volkov's documentation, alongside Blackmore's own internal authorization records, which the FBI had obtained through a warrant executed on their corporate records division the morning after Cassell's arrest. The authorization for the hospital operation had come from Blackmore's internal security division executive, a man named Terrence Boyle, who had signed a document euphemistically titled Threat Resolution Coordination that authorized the use of contracted personnel for what the document called field neutralization of evidentiary risk factors. Evidentiary risk factors. Colonel Voss had been an evidentiary risk factor. Claire had been an evidentiary risk factor. Dennis Farrow had been an incidental evidentiary risk factor, meaning he had died because of a document that used language sanitized to the point of abstraction. Boyle was arrested on day 2 of the hearings. Blackmore's CEO followed on day 4. The financial records produced enough to support a conspiracy charge at the executive level. The company's operations were suspended by federal order on day 6, which meant the weapons contracts it held, including 3 active Department of Defense supply agreements, were immediately under review. Claire watched it unfold from the federal facility and then from Harlow Peak, because on day 5 she went back. The East Wing had been cleared and was in early reconstruction. The blown-out window frames had been covered with temporary boarding, and the corridor that had smelled like smoke and adrenaline for days now smelled like construction dust and fresh sealant. The nurse's station where she had received Diane Sutton's corrections every morning for 3 weeks was intact, staffed by people who had been reassigned or brought in from other facilities, while the regular staff recovered. She hadn't come back to work. She wasn't sure yet what she was going back to. She had come because there was something unresolved that she needed to close in person rather than leaving open. She found Diane Sutton in the 4th floor break room, which was strange because Diane rarely used the 4th floor break room. She was sitting with a cup of tea, not coffee, specifically tea, which Claire hadn't known, and a crossword puzzle open on the table in front of her that she wasn't doing. Diane looked up. Claire sat down across from her, without being invited or uninvited. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Outside the break room window, the parking lot was half empty in the afternoon light, and there were still 2 federal vehicles visible at the eastern perimeter. "I want to apologize," Diane said. Her voice had none of its usual supervisory crispness. It sounded like her actual voice. "For the charting corrections. She stopped. "I treated you like you didn't know what you were doing. You didn't know what I knew. That's not really the point, is it?" She looked at her tea. "I've been doing this for 23 years. I've had a lot of nurses come through this facility." She stopped again, took a breath. "You ran toward the explosion." "Yes, I ran for the exit." She said it without self-flagellation, just as a fact, the particular honesties of someone taking inventory. Most people ran for the exit. It was the right thing to do. "It was," Claire said. "But you didn't." Diane looked at her. "I didn't know why you would do that. Now I do." A pause. "That doesn't make what I did right. I was dismissive and I was wrong. And people are alive because of something I was actively making harder for you to be." Claire looked at the window, at the parking lot, at the ordinary afternoon continuing outside while inside this room. 2 people sat with the strange, specific intimacy of having survived something together without being close to each other. "You're good at your job," Claire said. "The charting protocol matters. Procedures matter. The things you enforce, they matter when everything is normal, and they matter more when everything isn't." She paused. "You kept that ward running for 3 weeks with someone you didn't trust. That's not nothing." Diane said nothing for a moment. "Then are you coming back? I don't know yet. If you do." She stopped. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'll get you the right charting forms." Claire stood up. She was at the door when Diane said, "The surgical nurse. Petra Mole, the one who grabbed the attacker's arm. What about her? She's been telling the story to everyone who'll listen." Diane's voice had something in it now that took Claire a moment to identify as pride, not in herself, but genuine, uncomplicated pride in a colleague. She said she saw him look at the resident. She said she knew. A pause. She said she learned it from watching you all those weeks. The way you watched things. Claire stood in the doorway for a moment. "Tell her she did the right thing," she said. She went out into the corridor. She walked the length of it past the nurse's station, past the rooms where patients were again being cared for, in the ordinary, essential rhythms of a working hospital, supply corridor door, and the place where she had first heard voices in an electrical room and had kept walking. She walked to the window at the end of the hall. The gray van was not in the service lane. The service lane was empty. Of course it was. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at the space where it had been, and then she turned away, and she walked back the way she had come. In the federal vehicle waiting at the perimeter, Sloan had a briefing document and an offer that Claire hadn't agreed to yet, from a general named Doris Vane, who was building a program that didn't exist yet and needed someone who understood both sides of what a military hospital could become, when the wrong people decided it was a target. She hadn't said yes. She hadn't said no. She had said she needed to walk through that hospital one more time first. And now she had. And the answer that had been forming for 10 days, while everything else was resolving, had finally settled into something she could hold clearly. She got into the vehicle. Sloan looked at her. "Tell me about the program," Claire said. Sloan opened the briefing document. And somewhere in a federal holding facility 2 hours away, a man named Raymond Cassell sat across a table from prosecutors who had more documentation than he had believed possible, and began to understand that the systems he had operated within for 9 years were now operating against him with the same thoroughness and the same patience that he had once used to make problems disappear. The difference was that this time, the problem that was disappearing was him. The briefing document was 43 pages. Claire read it in the federal vehicle on the way back to the processing facility. And then she read the sections that mattered a second time, because the program General Doris Vane was proposing was not what she had expected, and she wanted to make sure she was reading it accurately before she formed an opinion about it. It wasn't a return to operational service. It wasn't a classified unit reconstitution or a federal security detail or any of the things she'd been half bracing for. It was a training program, a national curriculum for military medical personnel designed to address what the Harlow Peak attack had exposed as a systemic gap. Hospital facilities on or adjacent to military installations had emergency protocols for fires, for chemical hazards, for mass casualty events in the traditional sense. They did not have protocols for armed infiltration. They did not train their medical staff to recognize pre-attack surveillance, to move patients under hostile conditions, to maintain care delivery when the facility itself became a combat zone. The program had a name that bureaucrats had clearly labored over, and that said almost nothing. The Military Medical Facility Resilience Initiative. Claire made a note in the margin of the briefing document that the name should be changed. Then she kept reading. It called for a 12-week foundational curriculum, a cadre of 6 instructors with combined medical and tactical backgrounds, and a rollout schedule that would bring the training to 47 military medical facilities across the country within 3 years. The curriculum framework was skeletal. Whoever had drafted it understood the operational concept, but not the practical reality of teaching medical people to think tactically without eroding the particular. Mental orientation that made them good medical people. That was a harder balance than the 43 pages acknowledged. General Vane's cover letter was 2 paragraphs. The second one said, "We are not looking for someone to implement an existing plan. We are looking for someone to build the right one." Sloan was watching her read from the front passenger seat occasionally, with the patience of someone who knew what the answer was going to be and was waiting for the other person to finish arriving at it. "The curriculum framework is wrong," Claire said. "I expected you'd say that. It treats the tactical component and the medical component as separate tracks that integrate at the end. That's backward." She looked up. "You can't train a trauma nurse to be a security operative, and you shouldn't try. What you can train them to do is recognize, adapt, and maintain function. That's a different curriculum. General Vane's position is that the curriculum design is yours to determine. She's offering me that kind of latitude. She's offering you command of the program, full discretion on curriculum, instructor selection, and training methodology, subject to DoD oversight on budget and facility access." Sloan paused. She read your after-action notes from the hospital, the ones you submitted to the investigation team. Claire had submitted those notes 2 days after the attack, a 20-page document that she had written because she had needed to write it to process the sequence and identify every point where a different decision had produced a different outcome. She hadn't expected anyone to use it as a design document. She said the section on staff behavioral recognition was the most operationally useful thing her office had received in 4 years, Sloan said. Claire looked back out the window. The Wyoming landscape was doing what it always did in the late afternoon, going gold and enormous, the kind of scale that made everything human feel both very small and very specific, like the small thing was the only thing that mattered precisely because the large thing was so indifferent. She thought about what the program would actually require, what it would cost. The resistance she would face from medical administrators who didn't want their staff thinking about threat recognition because it was incompatible with the patient trust framework their institutions ran on. The resistance from military command structures who would want to standardize something that couldn't be standardized, who would want metrics for things that didn't produce clean metrics. The instructors she would need to find people who had the combined background and also the specific quality of being able to teach without performing, to transfer real knowledge rather than create the impression of it. She thought about Petra Mole, grabbing an attacker's arm in a room full of people and making a decision in under a second that had kept a resident physician alive. Petra Mole had not been trained to do that. She had watched someone do it differently for weeks, had absorbed something through proximity that she couldn't have named, and when the moment came, some version of it had been available to her. That was what the program was actually for. Not to produce operators, to make the Petra Moles possible, to build a population of medical professionals who had enough situational framework that when everything went wrong, they had something to work with. I have conditions, Claire said. I assumed. The curriculum is built from the ground up. Nothing from the existing framework survives if I determine it's wrong. I won't spend 8 months arguing about a document someone drafted without knowing what they were building. Agreed. Instructor selection is mine. I will not be given a roster of available personnel. I will identify who I need, and the program finds a way to get them. That will create friction with personnel management. Then we have friction with personnel management. She looked at Sloan. And I want Reyes on the team when he's recovered. He knows the material, and he's been through something that's going to make him a better instructor than anyone who hasn't. Sloan was quiet for a moment. Reyes's recovery timeline is, I'm not asking for him next week. I'm asking for a commitment that when he's ready, the door is open. I can give you. Sloan held her gaze. Anything else? Not yet. There will be. The vehicle turned into the federal facility. Claire folded the briefing document and put it in her jacket pocket, which was not what you were supposed to do with classified documents. But she was operating on approximately 4 hours of sleep, and the document had her notes in the margins, and she wanted to keep reading it. She said yes to the program 3 days later, in a meeting with General Vane that lasted 45 minutes and felt like a job interview in which both parties already knew the outcome and were using the time to establish how the working relationship was going to function. Vane was a compact woman in her late 50s, with the specific directness of someone who had spent decades in environments where directness was the only efficient mode of communication. She did not congratulate Claire on what had happened at Harlow Peak. She said, I read what you did, and I read how you thought about what you did, and those are two different things, and the second one is why you're here. Then she outlined the program parameters, and Claire outlined her conditions, and they negotiated 2 points and agreed on everything else. And at the end, Vane said, don't make me regret the latitude. And Claire said, don't give me reasons to use it badly. And that was that. The Blackmore trials began 6 weeks later and ran for 4 months. Claire was not a daily presence in the courtroom. She testified twice, once in the preliminary hearing that established the conspiracy's scope, and once in the main proceeding, in the direct examination that laid out what she had witnessed and done at Harlow Peak and what she had recovered in the hours after. She was not a comfortable witness. She answered questions accurately and completely and without elaboration. And when the defense attempted to reframe her actions as the behavior of an unstable individual operating outside authorized parameters, she answered those questions the same way. She answered the others directly, without heat, with the specific quality of someone who had been trained to report what happened rather than perform what happened. The jury took 3 days. Terrence Boyle, Blackmore's internal security executive, was convicted on all counts, including 2 charges related to the deaths at Harlow Peak Dennis Farrow and the military police officer, whose name was Corporal James Aldrete, 24 years old, from Albuquerque, who had been doing his job in the 4th floor corridor when the contractors came through the door. Boyle received 41 years. He would die in federal prison. He was 63 years old, and he knew it. Blackmore's CEO was convicted on conspiracy and racketeering charges. The financial instruments that had connected Blackmore's revenue to Cassell's accounts were mapped in forensic detail that took the prosecution 3 weeks to present and the defense 2 weeks to fail to rebut. The CCO's sentencing was set for a later date, and the number being discussed in the reporting was north of 20 years. Raymond Cassell's trial was separate federal corruption proceedings, ran on a different track, and it was longer and more procedurally complicated, and in some ways more publicly significant, because Cassell had been a name in the federal oversight infrastructure person who appeared at congressional hearings and policy briefings, and whose position was specifically designed to catch the kind of wrongdoing he had been enabling for 9 years. When the financial records were entered into evidence and the specific amounts and dates and routing mechanisms were read aloud in a federal courtroom, the coverage was extensive. The number $4 million appeared in every headline. The duration 9 years appeared in every second sentence. Procurement contracts that had passed through his oversight during that period, untouched and uninvestigated, were itemized in a supplemental document that ran to 300 pages. He was convicted on 7 counts. The sentencing was 26 years. He was 61 years old. He sat at the defense table when the sentence was read, and his expression was the particular blankness of someone whose internal accounting has finally been forced to reconcile with external reality, and who is finding the gap between the two larger than they had maintained it was possible to be. Derek Holt's sentencing came last. Claire read it on her phone, in a break between curriculum sessions, sitting in the hallway outside a conference room at the DoD facility in Colorado, where she had been running the first instructor training cohort for 6 weeks. The number was 18 years reduced from the prosecution's request because of the cooperation agreement, because Holt had ultimately provided testimony that the prosecution had found useful, because his attorney had argued successfully that his role, while significant, was subordinate to the operational principles. 18 years. He would be in his mid-40s when he came out, if he came out early. He would be a different person. By then, she suspected, though not necessarily a better one. Prison had complicated effects on the people who passed through it, and she wasn't naive about what those effects were. She thought about Dennis Farrow's daughter, who was now in her 3rd year of high school. She thought about Corporal James Aldrady's family in Albuquerque. She thought about whether 18 years was a number that meant anything to those families, or whether numbers always fell short of the weight they were supposed to carry. She put her phone away and went back into the conference room. Marcus Reyes came to Colorado in the 4th month of the program. He was not the same person he had been the last time she'd seen him, which had been years ago, before the disappearance, before Blackmore's people had held him in a property outside Douglas for 6 weeks. He was thinner, and he moved with a slight favoring on his left side that the medical notes said would resolve completely and that she could see was already better than it had been. His face had the quality of someone who had been through something that had rearranged their internal furniture and was still deciding where to put things. She met him in the facility parking lot when his transport arrived, because she wasn't going to make him walk into a building full of strangers on his first day and have the first face he saw be someone he didn't know. He got out of the vehicle, saw her, and stopped. They stood there for a moment. "You look terrible," he said. "You look worse." He laughed a short, genuine sound, and she shook his hand and then pulled him into a brief embrace that neither of them commented on, and then she stepped back and looked at him properly. "How's the side?" she said. "PT says another 6 weeks, and it won't favor anymore." "Good." She turned toward the building. "I'll walk you through the program. There's a lot to catch up on. Morrow." He fell into step beside her. "What I told them. The 6 weeks. Whatever they asked. You don't have to. I want you to know that I—" She stopped and looked at him. "I know. I've known since they told me you were alive." She held his gaze. "The only thing I want to know right now is whether you can teach a group of trauma nurses to think tactically without making them so paranoid they can't do their actual jobs." He looked at her for a moment. Something settled in his expression. "It's a harder problem than it sounds." "I know. That's why I need you on it." She started walking again. "We've been building the framework for 4 months. It's not right yet. It's better than it was, but it's not right. What's missing? The part where people understand that the skills don't replace the medicine. Send it." She pushed open the building door. "The whole model assumes that what we're training people for is survival. Survival isn't the goal. The goal is to keep functioning when everything around you has stopped functioning. That's different." He walked through the door beside her. "That's the whole curriculum. Yes, that's not 6 weeks of curriculum." "No," she said. "It's not." The formal program launch was a public event, not large, not ceremonial in the way that military events often calcified into, but attended by people who mattered. General Vane, 2 congressional staffers whose offices had been involved in the post-Harlow Peak legislation that had provided the program's funding, representatives from 12 of the military medical facilities that would be in the first rollout cohort, and journalists who covered defense and military medicine, and whose presence Vane had specifically sought, because she understood that programs with public visibility survived budget cycles better than programs that didn't. Colonel Garrett Voss was there. He had been medically cleared and had returned to limited duty while the investigation concluded, and he sat in the third row with his left shoulder, still in a modified support wrap, and the particular bearing of someone who had been the reason for a very bad day, and was committed to ensuring it had produced something useful. Naomi Carrasco was there. She had driven up from Casper, which was a 5-hour drive, and she had not told Claire she was coming. Claire saw her in the back of the room before the program began, and felt something that was specific and warm and didn't have a clean name. Diane Sutton had sent a letter. Claire had read it twice. It said, among other things, that 3 nurses from Harlow Peak's 4th floor ward had applied for positions in the program's first training cohort, and that Diane had written recommendations for all 3, and that she hoped the program understood what it was getting because she had learned something about underestimating the people in front of her, and she preferred not to repeat the error. It was a good letter. It sounded exactly like Diane. Petra Moll was one of the 3 applicants. When the program director stood to speak, which was Claire, which was still strange to her, standing at a podium in front of people who were there because of something she had done and something she was building. She had notes on the lectern in front of her that she had written and rewritten 4 times and that she did not use. What she said instead was shorter than the notes and more accurate than they would have been. She said that the program existed because of a gap that had always been there and that it had taken a catastrophic event to make it visible, which was the worst way to learn something was missing. She said that the curriculum they had built did not try to turn medical professionals into something they weren't, because that was both impossible and wrong. What medicine required and what tactical function required were not the same mental orientation, and you couldn't install one by overriding the other. What you could do was build a layer of awareness, a framework for recognition and response that sat on top of the medical training rather than competing with it. She said that every person in the first training cohort was already skilled at the hardest part of the job. They knew how to function when people were suffering. They knew how to make decisions under conditions of incomplete information and high stakes and physical exhaustion. They knew how to keep working when the situation was terrible. The program was going to teach them one additional thing that those skills transferred, that the competence they had built in a medical context was portable, that the same capacity that let a trauma nurse stay functional in a code situation was the same capacity that, with the right framework, could let them stay functional when the threat was not physiological. She said that she knew this was true because she had watched it happen. She had watched a surgical nurse who had never been in a violent situation in her life make a decision in under a second that required exactly the same mental architecture as a clinical decision pattern recognition, situational read, action without the luxury of certainty. She did not say Petra Moll's name from the podium because Petra Moll was in the audience and because some things were better said in private. She said that the program's goal was not to produce heroes. It was to produce people who were ready. Those were not the same thing. Heroes were a story you told after. Readiness was the thing you built before. Story came later, or it didn't. And either way, the readiness was what had actually mattered. She said, "The people we're training will never be famous for what they learn here. Most of them will never use most of it. The curriculum works when nothing happens. When a threat is recognized early and reported, and the situation is resolved before it escalates. When a staff member notices something that doesn't belong and acts on that observation. When the ordinary functioning of a medical facility is maintained because the people inside it had enough framework to see clearly when things were going wrong." Paused. That's what we're building. Not the capacity to fight. Capacity to see, to think, and to keep doing the work. In whatever conditions arrive. The room was quiet for a moment after she stopped, and then General Vane began to applaud, and the room followed, and Claire stood at the podium and felt the specific discomfort of receiving something she hadn't sought and was not yet comfortable accepting, and had decided, finally, to stop refusing. After the formal portion, in the reception that followed in the adjacent hall, Naomi Carrasco found her near the window with a cup of coffee. 5 hours from Casper, Claire said. I had nothing else going on. Carrasco looked at her with the direct assessment of a trauma surgeon, which was its own kind of scrutiny. You didn't read from notes. The notes weren't right. What you said was right. She paused. The part about readiness versus heroism. I've been thinking about something like that since the plant. She stopped. I was terrified the whole time. I want you to know that. I wasn't calm. I was absolutely terrified. I know. You weren't. I was. Claire looked at her. I was terrified. I was also functioning. Those aren't the same thing, and they're not mutually exclusive. She drank the coffee, which was better than the cold cup from the processing facility 2 months ago. Being terrified is just information. It tells you the stakes are real. What you do with it is the question. Carrasco was quiet for a moment. They offered me a consulting position with the program. Medical curriculum review. I know, I asked them to. Carrasco looked at her. You could have just called me. I wasn't sure you'd say yes. I haven't said yes yet. You drove 5 hours to a program launch on a day off, Claire said. You've said yes. Carrasco looked at her for a moment, and then she smiled a real one. Unguarded, the kind that appeared on people's faces when they've stopped arguing with something that was already settled. Marcus Reyes found her later, when the reception was thinning, and the formal visitors were leaving, and the space was becoming the more comfortable disorder of people who actually worked on something together. Voss wants to talk to you, he said. I know. I saw him trying to navigate across the room for the last 20 minutes. She looked toward where Voss was standing with 2 of the congressional staffers. How's he doing? Better than he should be. Shoulder's going to be an issue long term. He doesn't complain about it. Reyes paused. He said something to me earlier, before the event. What? He said that the 6 weeks that the 6 weeks that happened were because of him, because of the testimony, because they needed leverage. Reyes stopped. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was processing something that had cost him. He said he was sorry. Just that. He didn't explain it or justify it. Just said he was sorry. Claire looked at Voss across the room. He had turned slightly and caught her eye, and there was something in his expression that was both steady and old, the look of someone who had been carrying something and understood he would carry it for a long time. What did you say? She said. I said it wasn't his fault. Reyes was quiet for a moment. True. But it also isn't the whole thing. No. She watched Voss turn back to his conversation. It never is. She crossed the room and stood beside Voss until the congressional staffers had finished with him and moved on, and then she stood with him in the relative quiet near the far wall and didn't say anything for a moment. The shoulder, she said, functional. Mostly. He looked at her sideways. Program. What you said about readiness. Yes. I've been in the military for 31 years. He said it not as a credential, but as context, as the framing for whatever was coming next. And I've sat in 100 training briefings and read 100 curriculum documents, and almost none of them said something I hadn't heard before. He paused. That was new. She didn't respond to that directly, because she wasn't sure how to, and because it seemed to be the kind of statement that didn't require a response, only an acknowledgement. You're going to be all right, he said. It was quiet and direct and meant exactly what it asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. Her ribs had healed, the cracked one had knit cleanly, confirmed by imaging she'd finally agreed to 3 weeks after the fact. Stitches in her forearm were long gone, leaving a scar that would fade but wouldn't disappear, which was fine. Operational file that had followed her for 6 years was now part of a federal court record that had resulted in convictions on multiple counts, which meant it was no longer the threat it had been. It was evidence, used, deployed, its purpose served. Things she'd been running from had been turned into the thing that brought people down. She was sleeping better than she had in years, which she hadn't expected and which she didn't fully trust yet, but was willing to accept as information. She was still imperfect. She was still difficult. Still moved through spaces in a way that made some people uncomfortable, and she still noticed things and cataloged them reflexively, and still had to make a conscious choice, sometimes, to stop watching a room and just be in it. She had not fixed any of those things. She had stopped trying to fix them and started trying to understand which of them were liabilities and which of them were just who she was. Yes, she said, I think so. Voss nodded. Across the room, Reyes was talking to Petra Moll, who had come to the reception at Naomi Carrasco's invitation, and who was listening to something Reyes was saying with the focused attention of someone taking notes they would use later. Carrasco was near the door, coat on, car keys in hand, not quite ready to leave. General Vane was talking to 2 of the facility representatives with the officious intensity she brought to every conversation. The room was full of the ordinary, purposeful noise of people figuring out how to work together on something that hadn't existed before. Claire had not come here to become any of this. She had come to a hospital in Wyoming 3 months ago to disappear, which was the same thing she'd been doing for 6 years with decreasing success, and she had stopped a woman named Diane Sutton from correcting her charting notation and run toward a blast, and spent the subsequent weeks wishing she could take it back. Could not take it back. She did not want to take it back. That was the difference. Not the competence. She had always had the competence. The discipline or the training or the capacity to function in conditions that dismantled other people. She had carried all of those things through 6 years of trying to be ordinary, and they had been patient with her, and when she needed them, they had been there. The difference was this: she had finally stopped treating the things she was built for as something to be ashamed of. She had stopped acting as though the part of herself that could run toward an explosion was the part that made the rest of her impossible to sustain. It was the same person. It had always been the same person. She walked back to the center of the room. Outside the facility windows, the Colorado afternoon was doing its own thing. Cloud formations moving fast over the Front Range, the light changing every few minutes with the specific variability of high-altitude weather. Inside, the program she had spent 4 months building was beginning to take the shape of something real. It was not finished. It would not be finished for years. There would be resistance and budget conflicts and curriculum arguments and training cohorts that went wrong in ways she hadn't anticipated, and instructors who turned out to be wrong for reasons she'd misjudged. She would make mistakes. She had already made mistakes, and she would make different ones going forward, and the work would continue regardless because the work was larger than any single error. There were 47 military medical facilities in the first rollout, hundreds of nurses, physicians, technicians, administrative staff people who showed up every day to the work of keeping other people alive, who were excellent at exactly that, and who had never been given a framework for the moment when that work was threatened from the outside. She was going to give them the framework, not because she was fearless, not because what had happened at Harlow Peak had been clean or successful or some kind of proof of her individual capability. It had been chaotic and imperfect, and people had died who shouldn't have died, and she had made decisions that she still turned over in the dark sometimes, looking for the alternative she hadn't seen in the moment. But she had been ready. Not for that specific situation. No one could be ready for that specific situation. She had been ready in the more fundamental sense. She had the capacity to assess, to decide, and to act when assessment and decision were what the moment required. That readiness had not come from talent. It had come from years of training and experience and the discipline of staying functional when functioning was hard. That was what she was building, not heroes, not operatives, not people who carried weapons and ran toward explosions, people who were ready. She looked around the room one more time at Reyes and Carrasco and Voss, at the faces of the people who had come here because of something that had happened in a hospital corridor and was now becoming something larger than the event that created it. And she felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, that she was standing in the right place. She had spent 6 years choosing between the healer and the soldier, as though the choice was real, as though the two things lived in different people, and she had to decide which one to be. They had always been the same person. She had just finally stopped arguing about it. After the formal portion, in the reception that followed in the adjacent hall, Naomi Carrasco found her near the window with a cup of coffee. 5 hours from Casper, Claire said. I had nothing else going on. Carrasco looked at her with the direct assessment of a trauma surgeon, which was its own kind of scrutiny. You didn't read from notes. The notes weren't right. What you said was right. She paused. The part about readiness versus heroism. I've been thinking about something like that since the plant. She stopped. I was terrified the whole time. I want you to know that. I wasn't calm. I was absolutely terrified. I know. You weren't. I was. Claire looked at her. I was terrified. I was also functioning. Those aren't the same thing, and they're not mutually exclusive. She drank the coffee, which was better than the cold cup from the processing facility 2 months ago. Being terrified is just information. It tells you the stakes are real. What you do with it is the question. Carrasco was quiet for a moment. They offered me a consulting position with the program. Medical curriculum review. I know, I asked them to. Carrasco looked at her. You could have just called me. I wasn't sure you'd say yes. I haven't said yes yet. You drove 5 hours to a program launch on a day off, Claire said. You've said yes. Carrasco looked at her for a moment, and then she smiled, a real one. Unguarded, the kind that appeared on people's faces when they've stopped arguing with something that was already settled. Marcus Reyes found her later, when the reception was thinning, and the formal visitors were leaving, and the space was becoming the more comfortable disorder of people who actually worked on something together. Voss wants to talk to you, he said. I know. I saw him trying to navigate across the room for the last 20 minutes. She looked toward where Voss was standing with two of the congressional staffers. How's he doing? Better than he should be. Shoulder's going to be an issue long term. He doesn't complain about it. Reyes paused. He said something to me earlier, before the event. What? He said that the 6 weeks that the 6 weeks that happened were because of him, because of the testimony, because they needed leverage. Reyes stopped. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was processing something that had cost him. He said he was sorry. Just that. He didn't explain it or justify it. Just said he was sorry. Claire looked at Voss across the room. He had turned slightly and caught her eye, and there was something in his expression that was both steady and old, the look of someone who had been carrying something and understood he would carry it for a long time. What did you say? She said. I said it wasn't his fault. Reyes was quiet for a moment. True, but it also isn't the whole thing. No. She watched Voss turn back to his conversation. It never is. She crossed the room and stood beside Voss until the congressional staffers had finished with him and moved on, and then she stood with him in the relative quiet near the far wall and didn't say anything for a moment. The shoulder, she said, functional. Mostly. He looked at her sideways. Program, what you said about readiness. Yes. I've been in the military for 31 years. He said it not as a credential, but as context, as the framing for whatever was coming next. And I've sat in 100 training briefings and read 100 curriculum documents, and almost none of them said something I hadn't heard before. He paused. That was new. She didn't respond to that directly, because she wasn't sure how to, and because it seemed to be the kind of statement that didn't require a response, only an acknowledgement. You going to be all right, he said. It was quiet and direct and meant exactly what it asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. Her ribs had healed, the cracked one had knit cleanly, confirmed by imaging she'd finally agreed to 3 weeks after the fact. Stitches in her forearm were long gone, leaving a scar that would fade but wouldn't disappear, which was fine. Operational file that had followed her for 6 years was now part of a federal court record that had resulted in convictions on multiple counts, which meant it was no longer the threat it had been. It was evidence, used, deployed, its purpose served. Things she'd been running from had been turned into the thing that brought people down. She was sleeping better than she had in years, which she hadn't expected and which she didn't fully trust yet, but was willing to accept as information. She was still imperfect. She was still difficult. Still moved through spaces in a way that made some people uncomfortable, and she still noticed things and cataloged them reflexively, and still had to make a conscious choice, sometimes, to stop watching a room and just be in it. She had not fixed any of those things. She had stopped trying to fix them and started trying to understand which of them were liabilities and which of them were just who she was. Yes, she said, I think so. Voss nodded. Across the room, Reyes was talking to Petra Moll, who had come to the reception at Naomi Carrasco's invitation, and who was listening to something Reyes was saying with the focused attention of someone taking notes they would use later. Carrasco was near the door, coat on, car keys in hand, not quite ready to leave. General Vane was talking to two of the facility representatives with the officious intensity she brought to every conversation. The room was full of the ordinary purposeful noise of people figuring out how to work together on something that hadn't existed before. Claire had not come here to become any of this. She had come to a hospital in Wyoming 3 months ago to disappear, which was the same thing she'd been doing for 6 years with decreasing success, and she had stopped a woman named Diane Sutton from correcting her charting notation and run toward a blast, and spent the subsequent weeks wishing she could take it back. Could not take it back. She did not want to take it back. That was the difference. Not the competence. She had always had the competence. The discipline or the training or the capacity to function in conditions that dismantled other people. She had carried all of those things through 6 years of trying to be ordinary, and they had been patient with her, and when she needed them, they had been there. The difference was this. She had finally stopped treating the thing she was built for as something to be ashamed of. She had stopped acting as though the part of herself that could run toward an explosion was the part that made the rest of her impossible to sustain. It was the same person. It had always been the same person. She walked back to the center of the room. Outside the facility windows, the Colorado afternoon was doing its own thing. Cloud formations moving fast over the Front Range, the light changing every few minutes with the specific variability of high-altitude weather. Inside, the program she had spent 4 months building was beginning to take the shape of something real. It was not finished. It would not be finished for years. There would be resistance and budget conflicts and curriculum arguments and training cohorts that went wrong in ways she hadn't anticipated, and instructors who turned out to be wrong for reasons she'd misjudged. She would make mistakes. She had already made mistakes, and she would make different ones going forward, and the work would continue regardless because the work was larger than any single error. There were 47 military medical facilities in the first rollout, hundreds of nurses, physicians, technicians, administrative staff people who showed up every day to the work of keeping other people alive, who were excellent at exactly that, and who had never been given a framework for the moment when that work was threatened from the outside. She was going to give them the framework, not because she was fearless, not because what had happened at Harlow Peak had been clean or successful or some kind of proof of her individual capability. It had been chaotic and imperfect, and people had died who shouldn't have died, and she had made decisions that she still turned over in the dark sometimes, looking for the alternative she hadn't seen in the moment. But she had been ready. Not for that specific situation. No one could be ready for that specific situation. She had been ready in the more fundamental sense. She had the capacity to assess, to decide, and to act when assessment and decision were what the moment required. That readiness had not come from talent. It had come from years of training and experience and the discipline of staying functional when functioning was hard. That was what she was building. Not heroes, not operatives, not people who carried weapons and ran toward explosions. People who were ready. She looked around the room one more time at Reyes and Carrasco and Voss, at the faces of the people who had come here because of something that had happened in a hospital corridor and was now becoming something larger than the event that created it. And she felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, that she was standing in the right place. She had spent 6 years choosing between the healer and the soldier, as though the choice was real, as though the two things lived in different people, and she had to decide which one to be. They had always been the same person. She had just finally stopped arguing about it.